I'm Joseph Terwilliger. I'm a professor of neurobiology at Columbia University Medical Center. My expertise is in statistical genetics and study design for population-based genetic epidemiology projects. I'm going to talk to you today about a project we started back in graduate school when I had two classmates, Joseph Lee, who's also giving a talk at this conference. He's a genetic epidemiologist, and Dr. Gladys Maestre, who was a psychiatrist from Maracaibo, Venezuela, who came to Columbia to do a PhD on the genetics of Alzheimer's disease. And after she finished her PhD, she returned to Venezuela and wanted to build a research project in there, but there was nothing. So we had to start from scratch and build something from the very basic stages, which we did successfully. And I'd like to talk about that project now to maybe give you ideas of what you can think about to do in Kazakhstan, because Venezuela in the 90s had oil wealth, natural resources, an educated population, and a lot of great fancy equipment and everything, because it was a relatively rich country, but not a lot of reagents, not a lot of experience, and not a lot of software. It was a lot of hardware that they had. And they had to develop everything else from the very beginning. And I'm going to tell you how we did that and hope that it gives you ideas. So let me share my slides. I'm going to talk about the Maracaibo Aging Study, which is a study that we began in 1998 in Venezuela. Now, this is Venezuela. It's on the north coast of South America. It's blessed with incredible natural resources, including some of the best oil fields in the world around Lake Maracaibo here, some of the best beef in the world, along with beaches and other things and harbors, which should make it one of the richest countries in the hemisphere, but unfortunately it's not, due largely to corruption and other problems. Well, we're going to talk about a research study that we did here in the state of Zulia, which is the richest state in Venezuela. It's where the oil is and where the beef are over here. So we focused on two communities. And initially, at the very beginning stages, Gladys started her position there, and they didn't know anything about the health of the community. So she decided, okay, let's start by picking a region. She picked this community here outlined in red, which is Santa Lucia. It's a region in Maracaibo City that looks like this. It's relatively upper middle class. There's a lot of nice, fancy, colorful homes where people live quite well. They're in an urban setting, so they have basically all the problems of a normal Western urban population. Too much food, too little exercise, lots of diabetes, obesity, actually very high rates, it turned out, of Alzheimer's disease, as well as cancers and other problems. And good healthcare, though, and everything else was available to these people. And so it provided a nice model to look at what is the health situation of middle-class people in Venezuela. So we started the Maracaibo Aging Study there. We went around and we noticed that there were 3,765 people in that neighborhood who were 55 years of age or older. We went door to door, and 97% of people agreed to listen to us. We had some social scientists, cultural anthropologists, and people come in there to talk to people about their families. Who doesn't want to do that, right? So it was a very easy thing, and we had enormous participation. A couple months later, we went back and we did family interviews to try to build the structure of the population, because you know that in this region, there's a whole bunch of houses, and that means there's a lot of relatives living there. People don't move that far in Venezuela from where they're born. So you had lots of families there and extended pedigree. So we built those up, and 95% of these people still agreed to communicate with us and be involved. 5.8% had either moved or died or something else, because again, we're dealing with an elderly population. Phase 3, which was the actual invasive part, we still had 71% people participated. And in this study phase, we did neuropsych evaluations, neurological test batteries, cardiovascular assessments, importantly, including 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, which I'll come back to later. We also did assessments of their diet, their nutrition, did laboratory tests, again, to look at general health outcomes. And we tested a few genes like apolipoprotein, APP, and presenilins, things that were related to Alzheimer's disease and cognition, which was Gladys's primary interest. Not mine. I couldn't care less about Alzheimer's disease or any of these specific disorders. I'm more interested in study design in general health and looking at a wide variety of phenotypes and seeing how they interact. So you'll see how that comes back into this later on. So we decided we needed to look at a second population because that was relatively upper class, and we wanted to get something uniquely Venezuelan. So we looked at what they call these pueblos de agua, which are communities of water. And these people live And they're located here all around the shores of Lake Maracaibo, and it's largely indigenous population with some mixture from the Spanish settlers. But they live in places like this, over the top of the water. And you note that these look somewhat like Venice in Italy. So when Amerigo Vespucci and his crew first landed here, and this, by the way, this place that I'm showing you now is in the very northern part of Venezuela, up here in Sinamaica region. And this is the first place where Amerigo Vespucci's people found it. And they said, oh, it looks like Little Venice. So Venezuela, it means Little Venice, So that's how it got its name. So we noticed that there was a community like that here, Santa Rosa de Agua, within the city of Maracaibo, not too far from our population, Santa Lucia. It looks like this, however. Instead of living in these colorful houses in relative prosperity, they live on the top of the water in these relatively primitive conditions that actually look like this when you get up close. There's a lot of problems in this community. Basically, the toilet is kind of a hole that goes into the water. That's the sewer system. But they eat the fish out of the water and they swim in the water. And so they're constantly reinfected with ascaris, roundworms. And also, they get a lot of the heavy metal pollution from the Venezuelan oil industry, which happens to end up in this region. There's also a lot of alcoholism, drug abuse, violence, a lot of social problems, as is common in extremely impoverished communities. Yet, if these people live to be 40, it turns out that they live in enormously good health. When we did the same set of tests on these people that we did in Santa Lucia, we found low rates of obesity and diabetes, because obviously the food situation is not as plentiful. They're far more active because they're fishermen and they're walking around and living in a much less comfortable environment. And they don't seem to have very many plaques in the brain. The brains look amazingly healthy, even in their 90s. So it's a fascinating question to us as to why are they so healthy? Some people have suggested it might actually be the ascaris, because the human immune system evolved together with that. And only in the last couple of 100 years or so have we gotten rid of the infectious agents, the parasites. And then when you have this huge army that's designed to fight something and that something is gone, you can get revolutions and autoimmune disorders could increase. That's all speculation, but that is one of the biggest differences between these two communities. The other, of course, is that people here exercise more and they eat less. So all these things contribute to what appears to be somewhat better health despite living in horrible conditions as they age. We're fascinated by this, so we want to study more. I noticed this plank here is how you get from one building to another. And I said, I think I'll stay here. I'm not going to risk my 120 kilos falling into that water and becoming a garden for intestinal parasites of my own. So I decided to think better of it. But we did go there in the late 1990s, and we did a community assembly. You notice that I look a lot younger here. What we did is we went there to talk to the community and try to explain to them that we're honest people, that we're good, that we're trying to do something for the greater good, to learn about, genetic variation, learn about health. So one gentleman in the audience asked me, he said, so how is this going to benefit me? Are we going to get something out of this? Is this going to make us healthy? Is this going to make us healthier? And I said, no, it's probably going to give you nothing. It's going to maybe give us some information that could help your great-grandchildren, or maybe it'll be good for the general human condition. We'll learn something about what causes these diseases and maybe eventually lead to treatments, but you probably won't benefit at all. They said to me, they said to my colleague after, I said, that guy's an honest man. We trust him. We're willing to be involved in this study, because they didn't tell us a bunch of bullshit. They told us the truth. That's how you deal with it. You go there, you interact with people, you be honest with them, you build a relationship, and we've managed to maintain this relationship for a quarter century. Here we are a few years later, going back and giving a seminar series in their culture center for the elders in the community. This was our team. We managed to keep in touch there. As you see, it's a long time ago, comparing this to that. But what we noticed is this community is one family. We found that they're all related to us, and family is the most important thing, more important than anything in life. And we like large families, because genetics is all about why are relatives similar to each other. This is the pedigree, though, only a small subset of it. And this is a wonderful resource for a genetic study, something you will never find in New York City. Now, After we went there the first time and built this relationship, we got a grant from the National Institutes of Health, the Fogarty Center, which promotes international exchange opportunities. And this grant was a training grant for us to go back there, teach, build an infrastructure for telemedicine, for lecturing to them from here. Today, we can do it on Zoom, but you couldn't do that in the 1990s. You had to build basically a studio and a direct connection, and it was very expensive. But we got a grant from the US government to do that. And I went back there. Joe Lee went back there, and this is our colleague Gladys. We went there this is in 2004, to teach them how to do analysis, how basically genetics works, try to get the basics set across, to give education to that community so they could do their own research. We didn't want to do the research. We wanted to train them so they could do the research. We went back a few years later, and this was at the Cardiology Institute. We did another class trying to bring in different sets of expertise. This is Brad Town, who runs the Fells Longitudinal Study, the biggest longitudinal study in the world on aging. And he went there to try to teach from his experience as well about how to do these longitudinal studies to look at the effects of things on the aging process. We went back again. We finally got a research grant. This is, I think, around 2006. And this grant was called Gene-Environment Interactions in Cognition in Venezuelan Families. And the idea was to look at microcirculation in the brain as expressed through white matter hyperintensities, and because we had the MRIs on everybody, and their effects on Alzheimer's disease risk. And we had longitudinal MRI, so we're able to look over time at how the progression of the damage in the brain could eventually affect disease. A relatively simple question, actually, and it was something in Gladys's interests. So we, of course, did the research. We studied the risk of Alzheimer's and the genetics of ApoE4 allele. This was our initial study that we did in 1998. We used the new grant to do a follow-up evaluation in the early 2000s, where we did the same set of tests again, more ambulatory blood pressure measurements. So we had longitudinal data on this, and more MRIs. So we had longitudinal data on that. We, as I said, we emphasized ambulatory blood pressure and brain MRI. And we then got another grant. This time we got a grant to look exactly at these effects of the longitudinal changes in ambulatory blood pressure on Alzheimer's disease. Now, this was a small grant. This is called an R03. So it's just a small pilot study grant, which we got to database all the data we've been collecting over the years so that we could do this analysis of the longitudinal data. But we ended up with this set of grants, and we were able to accomplish the goal, like in this paper here, where we looked at white matter hyperintensities and showed that they mediated the association between ambulatory blood pressure and cognitive traits. That was the main focus of the study we were funded to do. But this is what I find fascinating, is that all the other things we were able to do as a result of having this study there. Venezuela is known most worldwide for the oil industry. Oil involves pumps and pipelines. Pumps and pipelines are the same, analogous to the circulatory system. Gladys and our group, we approached the people at the university there who developed the algorithms to study the effects of oil pressure variation in pipelines on the structural, integrity of the pipelines, because that's really important in the oil industry. Well, they've been doing this for 50 years already in Venezuela, and they had developed algorithms. And we introduced those algorithms from the oil industry into cardiovascular studies. And today, these algorithms are used in the machines that everybody gets to study ambulatory blood pressure. So they developed it out of the result of this project. Basically, the idea being that there's a huge difference between people whose blood pressure varies randomly around the clock, between those people and people whose blood pressure is relatively constant in the day and high and relatively lower when they sleep at night, but without a lot of variation. This kind of a problem should be less damaging than this, based on the data that they had from oil, where it was the variation, the changes in pressure in the pipeline were more likely to cause problems than constant but high pressure. These people went on to develop all these different tools with the ambulatory blood pressure, including their own machines that could be done. I mean, they developed machine learning approaches to it, as well as their own machines to actually apply this in practice. As a result of having this project and this data from our entire study on ambulatory blood pressure longitudinally over time, we had one of the best data sets in the world. So our colleague Gladys was able to team up with a group of Jan Steesen in Belgium, who are the world leaders in the study of ambulatory blood pressure. leading to joint publications in such journals as JAMA, Hypertension, Nature Science, top journals. She became one of the top leaders in this field because she had this study. Not only that, her student, this guy was a student in Venezuela, Jesus Melgarejo, who went on to do PhD in Belgium. And because he had all these great opportunities, because he was working with these really great projects, he manages now to get a professorship, an assistant professorship in America without even doing a postdoc. I mean, this has promoted her people from Venezuela to get really good positions so they can continue doing research in Venezuela on this data. Again, a lot more than was planned at the time we started this project. Well, we had people at Columbia who I was collaborating with on other projects who were experts on the eye, and they'd been working a lot with retinal disorders. So we thought, why don't we add retinal imaging? We'd already looked at microcirculation in the brain. Why not look at it in the eye as well? You know, because it's very similar. Here you can see it directly because you're looking in the eye. These are retinal images. In the brain, you're looking at it less directly, but you're still looking at the effects of microcirculation. So we teamed up with people in the Eye Institute and got this little grant here to do a pilot study. Well, that pilot study was able to keep a retinal clinic operational in Maracaibo at the height of the chaos as the government collapsed over there and the system was suffering intense pressures. We were able to prevent a complete brain drain and keep the clinic going, partially through the efforts of this project, which we were able to do. And what did we find? Unique opportunities existed because we had longitudinal data on 24-hour blood pressure, and we were able to show again, the same student was leading this project, looking at how normal tension glaucomatous optic neuropathy was related to 24-hour blood pressure variability in our study. The number of papers came out related to this, and it's pretty clear that people with glaucomatous eyes had much more examples of extreme variation in blood pressure or over the 24-hour cycle than did people with healthy eyes. It's pretty obvious and extreme difference. But now, Zika virus. You may remember the Olympics in Brazil. There was an epidemic of Zika virus. Everyone was worried about what would happen to the athletes. Well, the Zika virus epidemic also included Venezuela. It eventually hit our community. And we were doing the eye imaging at the time. Because we had this project going on, when Zika virus came through, we became the first people in the world to recognize and identify that there were non-congenital severe ocular complications of Zika virus infection. We were able to team up with the best infectious disease people in the world from Institut Pasteur in Paris, like Anavai here. And we published a number of papers looking at this in Venezuela, showing that optic neuropathy was associated with Zika virus infection, because we had the data from retinal images, from macular images, from visual field measurements, and from MRIs. We could compare all these different sorts of data and look at what's going on. Yeah? Unique opportunity presented by having a study and a new exposure comes through and you can look at its effects and its consequences. And what's really important about this optic neuropathy is that if it's untreated and it goes on for a few days, it becomes so bad that you do irreversible damage and you have permanent blindness in these patients. But if you catch it, it can be treated and reversed. So if you catch it in the first 24, 36 hours when there's a problem, it can be treated. So we were able to save the sight of a number of people because we've made this observation that nobody else had made. So again, a lot of good can come out of these projects in fields that are unrelated to that which was initially proposed to study. And we went on to do similar studies in Colombia and found similar problems where the ophthalmic manifestations of congenital Zika syndrome were real. Now, Venezuela has also gone through a humanitarian crisis over the last several years, and we're able to look at what are the effects of that on health, because we have an ongoing longitudinal study, which is measuring things as this crisis developed, as the food shortages came, and as other problems came. And we were able to keep people employed there, try to prevent a brain drain by keeping this study going and keeping the clinics operational with the funding that we got from the US government to do this project. And we were able to find some interesting things. And here's Gladys now this year already just getting an article about her project in Science, of all places, talking about how the long-running aging study is now charting the health impacts of Venezuela's collapse. She actually anticipates that the food shortages may actually be a positive thing in Santa Lucia, where people were obese and diabetic, because the shortages of food and the relatively more difficult standard of living means that they're going to be exercising more and eating less, and that probably might alleviate some of these problems. So some of it may be positive, some of it may be negative because the healthcare system's collapsing, there's less access to it. And so we're going to find out when this all is said and done. Just as COVID has passed through the community recently, and we're looking forward to seeing what the long-term effects of that are going to be on the population as well. So again, that's basically all I have time to say, but this is an ongoing project. And when you set up a good study from the beginning, even without a lot of money, this had 1 research grant from NIH, a training program grant, and 2 pilot study grants. That's not a lot of funding. And yet we were able to accomplish amazing things and build collaborations with the leaders in the world in cardiovascular epidemiology, in infectious disease, and in ophthalmology, and able to find things that far exceeded the initial anticipation of looking at what's the incidence of Alzheimer's disease and how is APOE related to it in our population. So if you build it, they will come. And that's basically all I want to say. Other than that, I really hope you think about these lessons and think about how you can apply them to the situation in Kazakhstan and develop some projects of your own, because I really look forward to the chance to come back and do some more training and some work with you, because I loved Kazakhstan the several times that I've been there, and I really wish I could be there today in person, but unfortunately it was impossible because of the relatively short notice for the conference. But I look forward to returning in the future and working together with you to build some really great projects for the future. Thank you very much.